And welcome everyone to the first MDC Practical Theology Guild. This is a new guild that we are starting to discuss sort of issues and topics related to practical theology. My name's Sean McGuire. I'm a DPT student here at the college and one of the organizers of this guild. This monthly meeting is open to all MDC students, faculty, alumni, and other members of our learning community who are interested in practical theology. And so our first portion of time together over the next hour is going to be structured as an interview with our esteemed guest. And the second portion will be an open Q&A. And so if you have any questions that you want to ask of him about anything that's been said or left unsaid, because this is a group of people who have largely read your dissertation, Neil, please keep those questions in your back pocket and you can ask them in the second half of our time together. We're also recording so that we can be sending out this the session to students who are unable to attend this morning, either because of work or because of time zone issues. And if you want to be receiving these recordings as well as updates of future meetings, you can contact Elizabeth Miller using the email address sent out to our school in the MDC weekly event calendar that was sent out earlier this week. And there's an email in there that you can send a message to be added to that email list. In the upcoming months, we have fantastic scholar practitioners who are going to be talking to us about topics such as worship, theological reflection methods, and more. But today, we are very excited to start off our guild with a topic and a guest whose work and whose dissertation many of us are very familiar with. And so without further ado, I'll hand things over to this morning's facilitator, Dale, to introduce you to our esteemed guest.
Thank you, Sean. I'm Dale Sanger, also a DPT student at McMaster and one of the organizers of the guild as well. Dr. Ferguson's dissertation, like Sean said, which we've all probably read, is called Practice-Led Theology, or Thinking Theology Through Practice. Now, I had Dr. Ferguson send me a bio, and so I had to Google some of the things, well, one of the things in it, but it says Neil Ferguson is the qualitative research advisor at Edith Cowan University in Perth, Western Australia. Neil works with postgrad students across the university on all aspects of the research journey from proposal to submission, as well as a range of training on many aspects of the research process. Neil completed a PhD at the University of Notre Dame in Australia on the application of practice-led research in theological faith-based context. His research interests include practice-led research, mixed methods, and critical realism. Neil is also an aspiring part-time chandler. And I had to look that part up. A chandler is a candle maker, unless Google steered me wrong.
No,
so that's right. So
yep.
So it's not the fan of the show Friends then?
No.
No. Okay. So part-time.
No offense to fans of the show Friends, of course.
So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Dr. Ferguson. We've given him a couple topics to speak upon, and then he can, at the end, we'll discuss them and we'll have some interaction back and forth.
Well, thanks, everyone. Thanks for inviting me. It's an honor and a pleasure to speak to you guys today. Dale's given me a few guide questions, I suppose, to address, which I'll sort of roughly go through. And I apologise if I sort of get off track from time to time. Dale, you have permission to bring me back to reality if I get distracted. I speak obviously out of an Australian context. I've studied in Australia and I've worked in my current position in Australia, obviously. So I'm going to use probably phrases and terms that might be specific to Australia or the application in Australia. So if you have any questions about some phrase that I've used or a concept that I've used, ask me straight away. Don't wait till the end, get clarification immediately. And in fact, if you've got any particular burning questions, feel free to interrupt me at any time. That's perfectly fine. One other thing is, even though I work at ECU, I'm here roughly as a private citizen. ECU is a secular institution, doesn't have a religion program or a theology program at all. So But it obviously, what I say comes out of my experience dealing with postgrad students in the practice-led research space. So with that out the way. So the first question Dale asked me is, what led you to PT and PLR as an interest for your thesis? The practice-led research part is pretty simple answer, actually. I was in Australia, we have an honours system, so I'd finished my one-year honours program and was looking around for a topic for doing a PhD, and the topics that my supervisor then were offering me were, in my humble opinion, boring and uninteresting. So I was looking desperately for something to keep me occupied for 3 years. I supported a colleague at ECU who was speaking to postgraduate students about research methodologies generally, and spoke briefly about practice-led research. And it was almost like a little light went on, and I could see almost immediately that the sort of the history of practice-led research and how it came about had similar applications in theology, specifically for me, but people in any kind of faith-based kind of environment, because faith is certainly the mental assent to certain doctrines and dogma and beliefs, but it's also something we live and experience and stuff like that. And the connection between the two parts of practice-led research, I could see that I could think my beliefs, but also not abandon them at the door when I came to a university, basically, which was kind of the traditional way. And it might, I don't know, it's a bit embarrassing to find out that people have actually read my thesis. Usually when you complete your thesis here, when I was at Notre Dame, it's bound. Not all universities bound them anymore, and people use them to keep their door open, stop it from blowing in the breeze. So it's very, very interesting that someone's actually read it. So I'm very, very pleased to hear that, obviously. But a little bit of history might help understand how I think about practice-led research. Is, as I understand it, originally sort of developed mainly in places like Australia, UK, Scandinavia, primarily as a result of structural and policy changes. So Australia's situation, for example, we had a 3-tier system. They wanted to amalgamate some of the things. So essentially, to cut a long story short, disciplines that weren't usually expected to do research were brought into an institution that expected you to do research. And all of a sudden, artists, dancers, musicians who weren't usually doing research related to their performance were said, okay, you guys are going to do research to justify your existence. And in a nutshell, practice-led research emerged out of that kind of dynamic, saying, okay, we are performers. How do we research while including our performance, our painting, our music, whatever it is? So that kind of dynamic, when I was thinking about this as a topic, meant that I could see that not only would I think about what it means to be a Christian, it also meant that potentially you could incorporate your experience, practice, whatever that might happen to be. Now, the obvious one is, if you're a worship leader or something like that, or a Christian artist of some description, it's obvious. But at ECU, we've had people in leadership doing practice-led research. We've had people in business, in various other disciplines, education, doing practice-led research, all using both the thinking and action to make their research come to life, for want of a better way of understanding it. but I found that what I originally thought I'd do is I'd go to the literature, get a definition of practice-led research, and sort of mold it to suit a theological context. But still true to some extent now, there's very little really concrete, fixed definitions of practice-led research that are generally agreed. Now, I think this is partly by design, but also it can be very confusing for students. I often hear students come to me and say, oh, my supervisor said, apparently I'm doing practice-led research, but I don't know what it is. Can you please tell me? Well, as it happens, yes, I can, but it all depends on their context. The next topic, well, next question Dale asked me is, PLR has long been associated with the fields of the arts. How do you see PLR being applicable outside of the arts? It might help before I answer this part of the question to talk a little bit about how I understand practice-led research to be, how it functions, what it looks like, and those sort of things. There's lots of models that people use when they're talking about practice-led research. General philosophical understandings like propositional and non-propositional knowledge, representing the two aspects. Aristotle's theoretical and practical knowledge, or Polanyi's focal and tacit knowledge. These are all helpful, but I'm going to argue that practice-led research consists of three elements, if you like. First one's obviously the robust intellectual engagement with your topic, whatever it happens to be. Theoretical, conceptual, propositional argument, all those elements. This is the sort of propositional theoretical knowledge, fact, theory, argument, statements, that kind of stuff. If we look back, the traditional thesis sort of had this as its main exclusive domain, if you like. Secondly, there's practice. What is practice? So in my thesis and with students, I do spend a lot of time trying to help them understand what practice is. But if I may, on a very rare occasion, quote myself, practice is firstly described as the set of skills, abilities, strategies that are characteristic of a particular discipline. Practice is also, secondly, what is characteristic of the output or product in a broad sense of the discipline. So practice in the practice-led research context is both a verb and a noun. It's a verb as in the doing, the action, the things we do as practitioners, whatever that practice might happen to be. But it's also a noun, as in the practice is the output, the things that this is our practice. Here's what our practice looks like. So these are still knowledge, both different types of knowledge, non-propositional, embodied, tacit, these kinds of knowledge. So often when I'm describing this to students as well, I'll use the two languages kind of idea. So when you're doing your research, you're speaking to your topic and ultimately your audience in two languages. One is sort of a propositional language, intellectual language, verbal, written language, and the other is the embodied knowledge, the tacit knowledge, the experiential, the visual, all those kinds of things. And when you're ultimately writing your thesis, part of your task is both to engage intellectually with your topic, but also to translate, if you like, for your audience, the knowledge that you are conveying through your practice, because not everyone is a insert practice here. So sometimes it's part of the role in your research to actually not only engage with your topic through your practice, but to help your audience understand what's going on in a language that they don't normally understand or speak. And each of these elements is an equally valid knowledge carrier, if you like, which is one of the unique features about practice-led research, that it kind of legitimizes us as researchers using a language that had been, if you like, excluded from the academy prior to the advent of practice-led research. And it's sort of related things. Am I making sense? Just sort of, thank you very much. And if that's what practice-led research is, it can be applied in any discipline at all where there is some kind of practice. Now, obviously, traditionally, it has been in the visual arts, the performing arts, music, those kinds of things, where there is obviously some kind of performative element. But it could be, I've seen examples in education, like I say, where students are investigating some particular element of classroom dynamic that are using some element of practice-led research. I've seen examples in counselling, but it could also be even examples like, I don't know, engineering and technology, where a research, you might be investigating some particular, I don't know, technological innovation, but your final thesis, whatever, it includes some sort of functioning, practical application of whatever it is that is part of the output of the thesis, rather than just talking about it. Here it is. Here's a functioning example of what I've been trying to demonstrate. But obviously, in a faith, theological kind of context, again, it could be anything. And I've just manufactured an example off the top of my head. You could imagine someone, say, researching, small groups in a local church. So your thesis would engage with all the theoretical elements related to the small church group dynamic, how they run, examples, models, group formation, all this kind of stuff. And you might develop a particular structure for running these kinds of groups. And so your thesis would include documents, for example, handouts and that kind of stuff that might go with that, plus some sort of recording, for example, audio, visual, video, something like this, of you with a group of people putting your particular method of running a small group into practice, for example. But anything, really, that there is one of these, there's an intellectual component and some kind of doing component. Now, this next one, I actually had to ask Dale what this was. It's not a term that we normally use in Australia, and the internet on this particular occasion was very unhelpful. How would a researcher choose the best sociological conversation partner for their study? For example, a person is doing PLR on a congregation that has experienced multiple splits. How would the researcher best identify the appropriate conversation partner? So the term conversation partner isn't something that I was familiar with. It's a term that we use here, but having got a very clear and succinct definition from Dale, it does make a lot of sense. So I'm going to answer it in kind of two parts, and we'll probably use terms that I'm more familiar with, but I'll explain them in a moment. So I want to answer it in from a theoretical perspective, and then from a more practical perspective. What you guys are calling conversation partner, we sort of tend to refer to something more like along the terms of the term theoretical perspective or paradigm, or this kind of idea. But I think they're similar. So essentially, one of the unique features about qualitative research, although I think practice-led research is not exclusively in the qualitative space, a bit of distraction, I'd argue that there are three broad streams to research. There's qualitative, obviously, there's quantitative, sciences, physics, etc. And there is a mixed methods approach. And I think I used to argue that practice-led research fits in the qualitative space, but I think it's probably more accurately fits in a mixed methods kind of space, because qualitative researchers don't exclusively use, let me get my terms, let me speak clearly. Practice-led research don't exclusively use qualitative methods. Depending on your particular discipline, you may find yourself using tools that are more characteristic sometimes of a quantitative space. But that's, not everyone agrees with me, even at my own institution on that one. So we'll get back to the main thing. So qualitative researchers argue that every part of research is underpinned and driven by some kind of understanding of how the world works, what constitutes knowledge, and how we can acquire that knowledge. So these are ontological and epistemological questions, essentially. All research is embedded in some sense, to some degree, more or less, depending on where you are, on a theoretical understanding of the universe, a historical context, a cultural context, and so on. We can, to some extent, try and bracket these, but nevertheless, there's always some element of that. So just two quick definitions, just to make sure everyone's on the same spot. Ontology is about what is real, what exists, what can be researched, which is an important point. And epistemology is related to how we acquire knowledge and its status as knowledge. Every individual has a usually unstated position on this. But when you enter a research degree, you're often specifically asked to make these kind of ideas clear, explicit. And I think in some senses, this is where what I'd call theoretical perspective and the notion of this conversation partner, I think this is where they kind of start to join together. So any theory, any of your conversation partners, any sociological perspective, any theology carries with it certain assumptions about what is legitimate, what's illegitimate, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable, what is knowledge, what can be researched. Whether they are compatible with your faith, for Christians, firstly, and secondly, whether it's research that's worth doing. Often these things are embedded in disciplines, but also within these theories and streams of disciplines that we're talking about. And it is certainly more than decorative. It's more than something that's got a section in your proposal or in your research. It impacts on all aspects. Your research question, your methodologies, your methods, which ones are appropriate for your research, which ones, how you analyse your data, all that kind of stuff. So which ones you choose are very much driven by the goals of your project, as most likely expressed in your research question. So what are you trying to find out? What do you want to actually know? What are you investigating? So the sort of practical aspects, and this is certainly a question I do hear a lot from students. Again, it's very much like my supervisor told me I'm doing practice-led research. What are you talking about? My supervisor said, I've got to have a theory. What are you talking about? No one's ever asked me these crazy questions. What are you asking me for? Now, one obvious source is your supervisors. Often the supervisors have, probably, I don't want to step on any supervisors here. I don't want to step on anyone's hands. Okay, I don't want to step in on any of your toes by anything I say. So please feel free to,
go ahead.
Okay.
Step away, just go. Yeah, we're good.
Oh, thank you.
I probably need to get my toes stepped on a little bit. Go ahead.
Oh. But certainly your supervisors should have some background in the area you're looking at, and certainly their input into what would be useful for you is a good starting place. Now, that doesn't mean you have to follow exactly what your supervisors say. And often that they're not giving that advice in a, you know, this is what you have to do. Although I have seen it, but that's usually not what's going on. It can be a really useful starting point. So ask your supervisors. Another common thing is, and this is like more something that will be, you might think of as like an osmotic process. As you read more, you read journal articles, you engage in books and topics, certain authors, certain phrases, certain ideas will keep recurring, particularly as you narrow your conversation. Some disciplines, like the education discipline at the institution I work at, has maybe a handful of particular theorists that are common that they use. They work for the kind of research they're doing. They function well in the Australian setting and so on. So these names will keep appearing. Now, again, that doesn't mean you have to use them, but often the reason they might be used is because they are useful for your particular discipline. They work well in the space that you're in. And then as you see these names, do the ideas have importance to your project? Do they work for you? Can you see them being applied in your space? So are there, I've kind of touched on this anyway, are there common approaches in your discipline anyway? Are there, so if you're doing a particular kind of research, are there common conversation partners, common themes, common authors that are used in your discipline? These can also be really useful guides. And again, doesn't mean you have to use them like you just take it out and you insert it into your thesis. Sometimes what it might mean is you use it as a starting point and you fine tune it, tweak it, modify it, take a bit here, a bit there, and make it work for your particular topic, because every topic is a little bit different. Every research question is unique in its own way. If you're doing research that everyone else was doing, you're probably not going to pass. I don't want to scare you. You've got to do something original. So everyone's topic is different. So it's useful to sometimes take something and tweak it according to suit your particular topic. Now, the last question that Dale gave me is, we're using practice-led research for qualitative research. What kind of tools do you recommend for qualitative research, e.g. applications? Now, I don't want to sound like a broken record, but
can I
the simple answer to that question is, sorry,
just say, can I interject? We have some of the faculty have to leave at by 10:02.
Yep.
I wonder if we need to skip this portion and move into Q&A. If that's
sure,
possible.
not a problem.
Maybe people can even ask those type of questions.
Yeah, sure, not a problem.
In the question and answer. I'm from a Pentecostal background myself, and when I was reading your dissertation talking about how the Pentecostals were hesitant towards the head knowledge, which is true. We've been historically that way. I also find, though, in the academy that there's the experience portion is not accepted in theological circles, and a lot of times. So I found PLR kind of a marrying of the two, where I can think theologically, but I can also express my theological beliefs through experience as well. So I found that very helpful. And so I just wanted to comment on that one portion, but I'm going to open up to questions. If anybody has any questions, feel free to unmute yourself and ask Dr. Ferguson a question. Very informative stuff so far, but if you have a question, feel free to unmute yourself and ask away.
Yeah, so Neil, thank you so much. Really appreciate this. And so I have two questions, one of which is, am I, is your dissertation, is this not published?
No.
Why is that? I use it as I teach, I'm a faculty member at MDC at McMaster. We use your dissertation as a required textbook in the course I teach on practice-led research methods. And yeah, so my students just access it online. I don't know, maybe I should work with we have a publishing arm here at McMaster that maybe
we've started a practical theology.
Yes, I know.
Yes, we'd love to lead with Neil's work.
Yeah, Wendy, I know you're the editor, and didn't want to put you on the spot, but I would love to see us. I would love to see us pursue that.
Hi, my name's Sean. Oh, hey,
ahead,
my name's Sean, and I approached Dr. Ferguson about this a few months ago, and the editors of, or he was the old editor, I guess, of the MDC press. So if you need a vote, I totally vote on let's get that book published.
Oh, look, yeah. I'd certainly be open to it. All this is completely news to me, that's for sure.
Sorry, I know we're throwing this out to you, but
no, that's, you know,
Dr. Porter would, I don't know, Wendy, you maybe we should pursue that somehow, because I use it as a text. It's a required text in my course, and
absolutely,
I'd love to be able to have students actually have the book, not just access access it online. So sorry, Neil. That's an aside. Maybe let's pursue that.
Yeah, sure.
I'll email Dr. Porter, Dr. Beach, and Dr. Ferguson together, and that way you guys can connect.
Okay. Yeah. And by the way, I'm an Australian. It's Neil.
Neil. Sorry. Yeah. So my other question would be around how necessary in practice-led research, how necessary do you think human-based research is in the sense that, doing whether it's focus groups or interviews or as opposed to, more traditional kind of more literature-based research, how important do you think it is to actually engage in a more human-based approach?
Extremely important. I mean, I deal with qualitative researchers across the spectrum, not just practice-led researchers, students doing interviews, focus groups, netnography, this internet sort of stuff, and even sort of, if we're talking about a spectrum, even the sort of autoethnography kind of idea. So I think it's really important because practice is something we do as people. It's human activity. It's something, which is why practice-led research, and to pick up a point Dale made earlier too, practice-led research, although it's sort of pretty well accepted now, it has had a bit of a rough ride. Not just the idea that, practice-led research in the academy, but this idea that, well, you dancers are just jumping about. How's this research? I hope this, I don't want to offend any dancers, but you see what I mean? This is the kind of struggle that practice-led research face, which is why one of the reasons that motivated me is that practice-led research does need an intellectual foundation, because it struggles. It still, to some extent, struggles for acceptance in certain parts of the academy, because academics don't really understand that there is this dual language sort of thing. We understand things in more than just an intellectual sense. We understand our lives through our experience, through our engagement with others. our very being is determined by our past to some extent, you know, our experiences, our life, you know, and I don't want to frighten anyone, but Dale may be a Pentecostal, but I'm a Catholic, you know, so this whole dynamic is, and so as a Catholic, I have a huge body of knowledge that I'm supposed to know. But it's a lived experience, just like any Christian. You know, I live my life as a Christian. You know, it influences my thinking, my behaviour for the most part. But you know, so yeah, no, extremely important to answer your question.
Yeah, that's good. Thank you. Thank you.
It's ironic though that even if we look at biblical texts, when we see the language in there, it's artistic in nature for a lot of it, like the Psalms, Job. Like when you have words describing God and you put the likes and he appeared as a wheel within a wheel, like that's a person using their creative side of their mind to describe something that's real, right? And so why do we in theological circles tend to say, no, the creative side needs to be shut off? Like, no, you just have to parse the Greek.
Well, to state the obvious, Jesus went around healing people rather than talking about healing people. He didn't write about healing people. He went around healing people, you know, and, you know, engaging with individuals and, you know, talking to them, sitting with them, drinking with them, eating with them, you know, anyway.
Hi, Neil. I have a question about one of the things you said during your presentation, and that in at your institution there are people doing practice-led research in all sorts of different areas, not just the arts, but you said they were doing things with leadership and other such areas. It sort of strikes me that your dissertation talks about practice quite a bit, and at the end you realize you really are talking about the arts because the practice is the creating of iconography. And so how do you see practice-led research being used in non-arts based research, things like leadership? What could you give us some examples of some of the projects that you've seen?
Well, the leadership example I can think of is kind of a bit of a hybrid. So it was a student who is actually in the art, but is a theatre director. So not a performer per se, but a director. And the kind of directorial dynamic in theatre is often a kind of like a directive, okay? Do this, stand there, move over here, this kind of stuff. And from her perspective, it was often men doing this. She's a woman, hence why I call her she, but she's a woman. And so it was a practice-led research project about exploring a different approach to the directorial experience and the whole leadership of a theatre team. So she engaged with leadership literature and then applied this in a context. And I think, if I recall, created a short performance piece. But it wasn't the performance she was exploring; it was the process of guiding the actors and the team in this kind of through this, you know, way of directing the performance, for one of it. Yeah. But I saw something the other day, and I didn't get a chance to read it, but it was in a different, and I've seen them in social work, and I've seen it in counselling, just examples where, because counselling and social work are very much this kind of human interaction, this two people sitting down discussing things, but it is in a ideological context. There's all these ideas and theories and processes and procedures and all this kind of stuff. So rather than just talk about them, write about them, then what the practice-led research legitimizes is this performance, and I use performance in a really general kind of thing, the actual seeing it in action, seeing it in thing. And often the actual physical thesis will include the written component, which interestingly for us is often, at least in Australia, called an exegesis, like an uncovering, I suppose, translation, but will include some kind of video or full recording of the performance or the process or the interview or whatever it is, and clips sometimes embedded in the thesis and all this sort of thing. And I mean, the reason I chose an iconography example in my thesis was partly at that time, I hadn't had the exposure, obviously, that I do now to the different advantages. And I was also trying to think of something that was familiar to the practice-led research space, but then shifted a little bit over to incorporate so that the faith was present in the actual output, if that makes any sense whatsoever.
Yeah, go ahead. Go ahead, Wendy.
Okay, just a couple things. One, can you just review for me what were the three elements that you said practice-led research consists of? I was looking closely, but then I wasn't quite sure what the third one was.
It's very possible. The reason you might not remember is it's very possible I didn't tell you.
Okay, I thought that's possible, but I'm just checking.
Yeah, the third element, and it's actually, and what I'm about to say is the most obvious thing, is it's often overlooked. And what did I do? I overlooked it. The third element is the integration between the two elements. Okay. Often what I see with some students is they come to the institution to do their whatever it is, art, performance, music, and this intellectual bit is kind of tacked on or added later on. Right. But a good practice-led research, these things are running parallel right from the very start. So the intellectual component is influencing how the practice, because that's kind of what you're investigating. And then the results of the practice is then influencing the intellectual engagement. So these things are running, I was going to say parallel, but that's not really true. They're kind of like,
sure, they're interacting, right?
Yeah, that's right. Zigzagging, bumping into each other throughout the whole thing. And so that when you get to the end, you've got this, there's two physical differences, but one argument, one intellectual engagement with the topic expressed in the two languages.
Okay, that's great. Then the second question is just to come back to Lee's question to you, and just to kind of push back a bit, that do you not think that historical research of a practice and how it was received and engaged in and all would count as practice-led research? It must be kind of in the moment, in the day, with persons right now. Seems to me like that becomes kind of an ostracization of the possibility of expanding practice-led research to, to cover larger periods of time, or just wondering.
No, not necessarily. Not necessarily. I mean, the practice-led research I've described is basically partly also how I see it applied, how I see people do it. But sure. There's no, and I mean, if we were very restrictive about this, we wouldn't have practice-led research in the first place. Those artists would have been thrown out of the institution, absolutely, 60 years ago. You're just wasting my time. Get out of here. We wouldn't have practice-led research. So absolutely not. It's an ongoing, like most methodologies that have, even those that have been around for a long time. There's always ways to modify it, always ways to tweak it, always ways to apply it in new contexts.
Yeah. Okay, good. Because I would hope for people to be able to span these, kind of integrate these as well, not just say it's can only be, person-to-person research. That's the only thing that counts. So I look for something a little bit more broad, I guess. Anyways,
Yeah.
thanks so much.
Sorry but I think I'm building on your question, Wendy. Neil, where do you see this going? Because I think here at McMaster Divinity College, we've kind of got our own. We're kind of using practice-led research, but I don't know, we're very liberal, we're loose in terms of how we use the term. We allow a lot of, we're just very kind of like, there's a lot of leeway in terms of what we mean by that. And sometimes when I read the literature, I feel like maybe we're not as true to it as we should be. I'm not sure, but where do you see? Yeah.
No, look, I mean, I wouldn't want to put any restrictions on practice-led research. The only restriction that I'd put on it is that it's got to, there needs to be some sort of rigorous intellectual engagement, which some students throw by the wayside, and it's got to be some kind of practice, whatever practice might happen to be. All right. I don't want to say practice is only people dancing about and playing the violin. All right. And I don't want to say it's any other thing. Knock yourselves out. That's my
Yeah. Well, I think that's kind of the route we're taking. Yeah.
I think to be a good Pentecostal, I see Paul Lucas's hand, but I think Dr. Zilla had a question earlier.
Yeah, thanks, Dale. Thanks, Neil. What a great presentation. Thanks for your time. I teach practical theology here at the Divinity College as well. And I'd like you, if you could, just to expand on what you look for in robust intellectual engagement with your topic. Are you talking about a literature review or something deeper than that? Or how does theology,
for me, it'd be something deeper than just a literature review. It would include a literature review. But the purpose of a literature review, as I see it, or as sometimes in the arts, they call it a practice review or something like this. The role of literature review is to provide, just cause for your topic, if you like, justification for your topic, and, source for intellectual engagement. But the robust intellectual engagement is actually engaging at a deeper level with the concepts that come out of the literature or are relevant to your topic. Because what you're trying to research something rather than just present on it or talk about it or something or other. You want to actually, you've got some unique question that you want to answer. So it requires some engagement with the topic at a philosophical, theoretical, topical, historical, cultural level, as well as engagement with the practice, whatever that happens to be. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, I really appreciate that, because I think assessing that dimension, the kind of the rigor of the intellectual engagement is really important, as you were emphasizing. And I think that that dimension needs to sort of help us to have some aims and purposes in writing dissertations that that engage deeply with it. So I appreciate that emphasis in your approach, because I think the idea, often is that PLR is kind of soft research, and you're sort of saying, well, if it's integrated correctly, deeply, then it's not, and I like that approach.
And look, it has a reputation sometimes for being soft research, but depending on who you talk to, qualitative research has a reputation for being soft research. If you talk to a particle physicist, they're going to laugh at you that you're doing interviews or something, just because they can't interview a proton or something or other. That's not my problem.
Well, they can. It would just be a very short conversation.
That's right. That's right.
Paul, I'm going to let you ask the last question here today.
Thanks. And thanks for your dissertation. I remember when I was taking Lee's class, my mind was being torn apart by all the different definitions. So your dissertation was like a breath of fresh air, understanding some of this and learning it. My question is about sort of along the same lines of moving from artistic forms of practice-led research into theology. Specifically, when you talk about, and when we talk about art, often it's the performer researcher, like the researcher is actually doing some sort of performance or presenting a piece. And then when we move into some of the more pastoral things, there often has to be, there's ethical implications of someone. So I'll use the example of pastoral counseling. There has to be an arm's length of that. And one thing that sort of, like in the program, I sort of had an idea early on of what practice-led research, and then when we learned about the ethics implications and stuff, that shifted over. And so I guess my question to you is, where would you see, like in the research I'm doing, I feel that it's definitely different than the idea of someone doing their own performance or doing their own piece. It's more so, it's in my practice as far as it's in the realm of work, and it's relevant to like ecclesiology and church, but it's not actually me doing it. Whereas when you talk about performance arts, I feel that is doing it. So do you think there's something lost when practice-led research enters something with ethical implications, or does it just need to be navigated?
Look, I think I'll answer that question initially indirectly. The institution I work at has a long-standing education school. I think it's one of the oldest in WA. It's one of the oldest in the country. And they're constantly facing ethical issues because it's at a school. So we're talking about young children. They might be working up the north of our country with the Indigenous population, which requires an extra layer and stuff like that. So there's always struggles that they face in order to do their research, but still respect their participants fully. So that's also the case with people in the counselling space, all those kinds of things. But even in the health space, when you're dealing with people's health records, there's huge, and you can't just go randomly injecting people with stuff or running by them and taking their blood samples. Do you mind? Thanks. Bye. So I think one of the last things you said is about navigating. I think that's the question. It's about navigating. And if it comes down to it, if you have to do, you can't use video, you can only use audio. You can only use, I don't know, some other process. You have to do a reenactment. You have to use actors instead of real people. Look, that's, as long as you're upfront and clear about it, about how you came to be in this particular position. And you might have a case where, I mean, it's pretty rare, but it does happen, where you've done all your practical stuff, you've done your interviews, you've had your focus groups, you blah, 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 you're doing your write-ups 3 days before your thesis is due. Fred Jones rings you up and says, I've changed my mind. Please take me out. You are obligated to do that. You have to take them out. Well, at least, I presume that's similar for you guys. You have to do it. And so if it comes down to it, you've got some plan for your practice research. It involves that sort of thing, but it's just not going to happen. Either adopt another methodology, that's perfectly fine, or change the dynamic, the way you express that particular part of the research. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. I guess my question is more specific to the role of the researcher in it, because when like the literature on the art practitioner researcher, is very much based on the idea of like the doing of the researcher. So my question was more specific. That is really helpful, by the way, but my specific question was more so, is there something lost when it's translated to something with those ethical guidelines?
Oh, I see what you mean. So if you're outside the practice, if you like.
Yeah, outside or an ethical arm's length.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Look, at one level, yes. At one level, yes, there is something lost. Because whether you're, and look, this is, you know, if I give you a hardcore qualitative spiel, doesn't matter. The notion of arm's length is a bit of a furphy. All right, your arms will never be long enough to be at arm's length. All right, so at one level, you know, you can't be at arm's length, but at another level, you know, like we were talking about before, I wouldn't want to impose any specific restrictions on practice-led research if you can make it work, if it engages with the three criteria that I'm suggesting, you know, some sort of practical, some sort of theoretical, and the integration of the three, then, you know, who am I?
Thank you very much. We're going to close it there because the faculty does have to get to another meeting. Neil, this was great. It was very helpful to us. And I have emailed you and Dr. Porter and Dr. Beach together so you guys can interact about that dissertation publication. Very enjoyable. Thank you very much. It's
Thank you.
I'm the only one you're hearing clapping, but everybody's clapping. But
my pleasure.
Thank you. And now you can. It's 11 o'clock in Perth, so you can head off. Take your tie off. We didn't require that, as you see, but you can take your tie off.
No, but I normally wear a tie to work, so I thought, oh, you know, I won't tell you what kind of trousers I'm wearing, but never mind.
That's typical Zoom. It's Zoom attire. So I'm going to turn it over to Sean to just close it out and let us know what's coming up in the next month or so.
Just as a final note, an invitation for our next session, which is on February 14th at 1 p.m. We're going to be joined by Dr. Glenn Packiam, who's a pastor out in Denver, Colorado, a really accomplished musician and academic who will be talking to us about his recently published dissertation, Worship in the World to Come, as well as talking a little bit about how to continue as practitioner researchers in our vocations after graduation. So you can mark down February 14th at 1 p.m. and the link will be sent out closer to that date. Yeah, thank you so much, Neil, for joining us. And thank you everyone for joining as well.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.